Hey, thanks for joining us today for this video. I'm Paul Del Rio, Communications Director for Kentucky Realtors, and joining me today is Jason Vaughn, KYR Legal Counsel. And today we're going to be talking about escalation clauses. I believe I have a good understanding what an escalation clause is. I'm a user of eBay, and when you put in your maximum bid, the machine will automatically bid up for you if another buyer outbids you. And I'm guessing, Jason, that's escalation clause kind of works that way?
Yeah, it's actually very similar. So if you used eBay and you created a bid and you said it's going to go up this high and I'll go up and I'll match the incoming bid up to a certain point, that's pretty much the basics of an escalation clause. As far as it goes with the real estate contract, it's basically saying I will pay X for the price of this home. But if the seller receives another offer that's higher than mine, I'll be willing to increase my offer to up to Y price.
Okay, well that makes sense. And here we are in the fourth quarter of 2020. We're kind of hopefully approaching the tail end of this global pandemic, and I'm guessing that has a little bit to do with why escalation clauses are kind of being talked about a little bit more.
Absolutely. Escalation clauses have been around for a lot of years. They didn't really become quote unquote legal in Kentucky until maybe 5 years ago. 5 or 6 years ago, I think.
Okay.
Prior to that, you weren't allowed to use an escalation clause. And up to the last couple years, you didn't really see it used that often. But you now have a situation in which everybody's trying to make their offer look more attractive to sellers. And one of the ways that people try to do that, or one of the tactics they try to use, is the escalation clause. They're trying to make their offer look more appealing and to interest the seller into choosing their offer. And, it really sounds like a good idea, at least initially, for a buyer that's trying to win a bidding war. And sometimes it sounds like an even better idea for a seller that knows he's operating in a limited supply market, and they're trying to get the highest sales price they can.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, getting into the nitty gritty a little bit, what does an escalation offer usually look like on a contract? What does that include?
Well, there's three things you're going to see almost all the time or all the time in Kentucky. And the first one's going to be the original offer, meaning that base offer amount. So let's say, for example, you're making an offer and you say, look, I will pay $200,000. That's your base offer. Then what you have is the escalation amount. And that is the incremental amount the base price will be increased above any other competitive bid. So if you say, I will go $2,000 higher than any other offer you receive. So if the other buyers come in and they say, I'm going to offer 205, now your offer has escalated to 207. Now, one of the things about Kentucky, and in most states actually, is that there has to be a maximum limit to the escalation. Meaning you say, I will give $200,000. I will escalate it by $2,000 to be competitive. And I will do that up to a set amount. So let's say $225,000. So you have the original offer, the escalation amount, and the maximum limit of escalation. Now, realize that you need all three of those to create a valid escalation clause. Sometimes I have heard of people leaving the maximum limit of escalation off, and that's a mistake because that is an offer, at least from the KREC, is not valid.
Okay, that makes sense. And that I would think the buyer would be quite regretting leaving off a maximum bid if that were valid, and that kind of price went a little out of control.
That's right. That's right. And it could be because if an agent doesn't include the maximum limit of escalation, that could create potential liability on the agent. So they want to make sure that they have all three of those components in their offer.
Okay. Now, in this kind of time where the market is a little lopsided, and it is a seller's market, should a realtor expect to put an escalation clause in most any contract? What are they weighing on whether or not to put an escalation clause in an offer?
Well, one of the first things they should look at is try to have a reasonable understanding of what type of property they're dealing with. So, for example, if you are in a first time, second time home buyer area, meaning one that moves pretty quickly, is a very steady market, and probably has a lot of interest in it, then an escalation clause might be needed for you to differentiate yourself from everybody else. On the other hand, if your property is sitting out in some spot that will not receive multiple offers, or hasn't been receiving multiple offers, or has been on the market for an extended period of time, an escalation clause might not be what you want to do, because I don't know that it would make it any more interesting to a seller if they know multiple offers will increase it, but they haven't been receiving multiple offers. So what the agent should bring their experience to say is, hey, in all likelihood, we are going to be in a multiple offer situation. Now, one of the other things that they want to look at is the time period. So, for example, if you were in a situation and the seller told you, I'm going to start accepting bids on my offer on January 1st, and I'm going to end my offers on January 14th, well, you might not want to put an escalation offer in on January 1st, because it's going to sit there for a long time, and that time is going to be used by the seller to try to get offers in to increase the escalation clause. Now, on the other hand, if the seller comes to you and says, okay, we've got multiple offers and we are going to make our decision in the next 24 hours, an escalation clause might be very effective there, because it is basically puts you ahead of the pack potentially, and made it more likely that the seller will be interested in accepting your offer. Now, one of the important things, though, that you need to recognize as a buyer is that when you're doing this, you are clearly saying one thing above all else, and that is, I will pay more. You're starting off your negotiation by saying, I will pay more than I'm saying I am offering right now. That's important, because you may not want to be saying that right off the bat, or you may be wanting to say that right off the bat. But keep that in mind, because that's what the seller is hearing. All law things aside, what the seller is hearing from you is that you are willing to pay more than what your offer is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, that sounds like a great something that a seller would want. But are there sellers that refuse to accept offers with escalation clauses in them, and why would they do that?
Yeah, there are sellers actually that will do that. We've had a lot of calls on the hotline saying it's okay to refuse to accept escalation clauses. Sure, you can tell people we're not going to accept offers that come in this way or that. If you are the listing agent, you want to make sure you get that direction in writing, and that you include it in your listing, because that is a specific direction, listing agreement, because that is a specific direction from the seller. But some home sellers state that they will not accept an offer with an escalation clause. They would prefer that every buyer submits what they are willing to pay for the home or the real estate right then. Sellers sometimes prefer that because it motivates buyers to outbid one another on the first try. Mm-hmm. It also streamlines the contract paperwork and decision-making process. So you're going to see some people that are like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to deal with a situation in which I've got multiple escalation clauses coming in, or staggered offers or something like that. They know to some degree, or they feel comfortable that in this market, sellers can kind of control things, and what they'd rather do is just have a clean upfront offer of the maximum amount the buyer is willing to pay.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a lot of work on the seller's end, and especially with the realtor kind of managing all that, especially with multiple offers with multiple escalation clauses.
Exactly.
So what should be also included in a good escalation clause? I mean, what kind of language needs to kind of button that up?
Yeah, so we've told you that there are three terms that need to be in there no matter what. And that's the original offer, the escalation amount, and the maximum limit of escalation. But let's think about this. You want to do some other things that will protect you when making the escalation clause offer. One is that you want to include language that says only bona fide offers and or arm's length transactions can trigger the escalation clause. So let's think about this. Paul, you're selling the house, and you find out that I've made you an escalation clause for $200,000. And you go over to your close friend and you say, hey, come in and offer $250 or $226 or $223, whatever the amount, and that I get an extra $2,000. It doesn't work that way, because that's not a bona fide offer. And if it's among family members or among close associates, it's obviously not an arm's length transaction. So you want to include that language in there so that somebody doesn't try to manipulate the transaction with a fake or offer that's not really legitimate. The next thing I'd say you'd want to do is you'd want language indicating that the net proceeds of any offer must exceed the net proceeds of the escalation offer in order to trigger the escalation clause. And what I mean by that is you can't just look at one number on the thing. You've got to look at everything that's involved. So if my offer comes with this and maybe some other intricacies or some other monies in that amount, the other one's got to match it to trigger it. It can't be like, oh, well, you get this, and then I also want this other piece of land that yours didn't contain. At least the subject has to be the same, and you're really looking at the net amount that the seller would receive in order to determine whether or not it triggers the escalation. Also, one of the things that you're going to want is language indicating that the escalation clause cannot be triggered by a subsequent offer that contains an escalation clause, unless the subsequent offer's base price results in greater proceeds to the seller than the original offer's base price. So let's say I say, I want to make an escalation offer to you for $200,000 up to $225,000 in 2,000 increments, and you get another one and it's for $200,000 as well. You can't bounce those off of each other. You want to include that language that says they can't go back and forth. But if the other offer comes in at, let's say, 202 as a base, then could that trigger yours? Yes. Now, there are some areas, and one of the big questions is, what happens if you have two escalation clauses and they're coming in and they're fighting each other? Are they triggering each other each time? You know, that's very difficult to answer because there's not been any clear case law in Kentucky on this point or a clear decision on it. There are arguments both ways that say you can accept two escalation clauses. There are other arguments that say that you can't. And it's important to keep that in mind. So if you're the buyer and you even want to avoid that eventual thing, include in there that another escalation offer cannot trigger yours. Lastly, language that requires the seller to show proof of the existence of any offer that purports to trigger the escalation clause, and a reference to what proof would be satisfactory. So let's imagine that they come to you and they say, well, your $200,000 offer was countered with another offer came in at $215,000, so you now owe $217,000. And you say, okay, show proof. Well, if they just say, well, here's the name of the other agent, but we're not going to show you the contract, that may not satisfy you. So you want to say, look, I want to be able to see the other contract that triggers my escalation clause. I'm sorry, I'm just not going to take your word for it alone. I mean, that's perfectly legitimate because you've increased your offer a significant amount based upon that incoming offer. So in that situation, that's something to do to protect yourself. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that, and we're going to kind of draw this out a little bit, that first offer that you make as the buyer that includes an escalation clause, that's fine. That's, again, the 200, the 2,000, up to 225. If you're the second offer coming in, what you might want to get is an agreement to keep your offer, this is the second offerer, your offer confidential. And if you can get that agreement, now you know in all likelihood your offer can't be used to escalate the escalation offer because it can't be shared. It's confidential. So you've now made an offer in which you are no longer competing against an escalation clause because you've ensured that your offer is confidential. So it's something to keep in mind and something you may use if you're scared of potentially entering into a negotiation in which there may be an escalation clause to which you're not aware.
Okay. So this is a really simple concept that gets very complicated very quickly. I'm getting that impression. So if a seller does accept an offer with an escalation clause, can they change their mind then and they're saying, you know, for whatever reason and say, okay, no, I want to accept this other offer. I don't want to deal with this anymore?
Yeah, this is a popular misconception, and it's a very good question. A lot of people seem to think, oh, well, you know, if I get a better offer that's 100% financing versus the escalation clause, or 100% cash, and the escalation clause was 80% finance, and I'm more worried about the sale happening than I am about the amount getting, I'm just going to dump the escalation clause and take the other offer. You can't. Remember, on an escalation clause, it doesn't start triggering and it's not effective unless you accept it. Now, once you accept it, that's the person you're selling to unless it gets to that maximal amount. So you're locked in. So you can imagine, let's say you're wanting to move very quickly. An escalation offer comes in that you accept, again, the same 200, 2,000, up to 225. And somebody walks in and they say, hey, I'm willing to pay 200,000 cash tomorrow. I've got the money right now. Let's close. No inspections, no anything. I'll take it as is, what have you. That's a really attractive offer. You want to take it, you can't. You're locked in on the escalation clause. You are in a contract. The only term that's moving still is the purchase price. But the duty to sell and the duty to purchase has been connected. You're tied. You're tied together.
Okay, that makes sense. You're accepting that. You're in a contract. So what about any backup offers? Can seller accept anything more?
Yeah, I actually have had this question a couple times, and they say, well, I'm going to accept the escalation, but I'm going to treat these other offers as backup offers and sign them too. Well, you can't. You can only sign up a backup offer if that person knows they're the backup offer. Right. So that means that you can't just, somebody makes an offer that's that the escalation clause beats the second best offer, and you want to take both in case this one doesn't work, the escalation one doesn't work. You can, as long as the buyer knows they are now, buyer number two is now a backup offer. So you need to keep that in mind. You can't just accept it because it came in second. You're locked in with one. You can take another one, and it is a backup offer only if the buyer agrees for it to be a backup offer, and that agreement is in writing.
That makes sense. Well, Jason, I appreciate you taking the time and explaining this concept. I know a lot of realtors are probably hearing this, if they hadn't already, are hearing it a lot from their peers, and this is a tool in the toolbox as they're getting creative in this market and how to compete and get their buyers into homes. So thanks again, Jason. I appreciate you joining us.
Well, Paul, I appreciate it, and until next time.